White folks don't understand why a black man can say that word, even in context, and they can't, which is really interesting. Like, why white folks need to say the word so badly that they're upset when they can't. Let me just really clearly articulate the difference between the president, a man of color, using that term in context, and a white person using it at any time. The difference is, it's like I'm a Southerner, right? And I don't much like it when Jeff Foxworthy does 20 minutes of redneck jokes in his act, but that's sort of how he made his career. And I don't flinch at it because he's a Southerner. So when he uses that term, I don't think to myself, wait a minute, you know, maybe he hates Southern rural folks, because I know he's part of the family. On the other hand, you know, if Jerry Seinfeld were to stand up and do 20 minutes of redneck jokes, I would have a problem with that. Or Jay Leno, because they're not in the family. It goes back to third grade or maybe kindergarten wisdom, which is, I can talk about my mama, but you cannot talk about my mama. And so whether or not it's appropriate, whether or not he should have said it, obviously he was sort of indirectly quoting others. The real issue is, for those of us who are white, to think that we ought to be able to say it because black folks often or sometimes do is absolutely absurd. It's a mentality of entitlement. It's not appropriate for us. It's like, I'm Jewish. If I tell Jewish jokes, that's one thing. If the Jewish joke is in the church bulletin, we have a problem.
I've been watching a very interesting thing happen in the last year or so among my friends, colleagues, peers of color, talking about the fact, how do we feel about it? Where do we stand? And it's an interesting dialogue to have within the black community. What are you hearing? What is your experience with that?
Well, my experience, I mean, I'm a writer, right? So, and I come at it from a linguistic perspective, which is that you cannot excise the language, because the word, as mean and hateful as it can be, is a big word, important word in the literature.
And granted, just if we got rid of that word, there's a whole bunch of other words that do as much damage, if not more.
But you can't actually get rid of it and actually have conversations about history and about hate and about race and about racism in America and get rid of this word. You have to use it, but you have to use it in context, historical context, kind of instructional context, which is what the president was doing here. He uses his word several times in his memoir. I wrote a memoir. I use it several times in my memoir because it is historical. It means something in that moment. I couldn't talk about my coming into self as a racialized person in a predominantly white country without illustrating the moment that I first heard that word used against me, or talking about how that word was used in, as Tim was saying, in group, where people take words that are meant to hurt them and play around with them like silly putty, right, and so that it gets soft, and so that it doesn't hurt you every time that you hear it. And that happens not only in racial groups, it happens with
we've seen it in the women's lib movement, we've seen it in the gay community, we've seen the idea of reclaiming. What of that, Tim, in terms of the usage of this word? I mean, we've been debating this here at CNN for a long time about the idea of reclaiming a word and the usage of it. I mean, that's not, again, this was not contextually what the president was talking about. He was talking about the state of race in this country. Why is it so difficult for us to have these conversations in this nation?
Well, part of the difficulty is we're focused more on the terminology. I think this is the point the president was trying to make. We're dealing with the terminology and not the systemic and the structural injustice that is at the root of that. It's the system of inequality which actually dehumanizes black and brown bodies to the point where people like this shooter in Charleston go and use that term openly in his manifesto. We need to deal with the systemic and the structural, and the personal will take care of itself once we've dealt with the larger problem.
And the problem there is you're not going to get consensus, right, on the fact that those structural and institutional problems exist.
Right.
That's where the problem lies.
But this is illustrative of that, right? So if you can be up in arms about the president using this word one time and not up in arms about all of the other presidents who have used this word in ways that were meant to be destructive and mean and dismissive of black people, if you cannot be as angry with those presidents who weren't talking into a live mic, consciously making the choice to say this is wrong to do, but rather doing it in background in ways that they never thought would ever see the light of day. If you are not just as upset at this man being called the N-word as him uttering the word, then you are part of the structural racism that makes this conversation almost impossible.
Is there anything, Tim, to the idea that the noise about the president's use of this word is going to supersede what he was trying to say?
Oh, well, of course, because it's a distraction. If we can make President Obama the reason for every problem under the sun, politicizing whatever he says, then we don't have to deal with racism. The Wall Street Journal said in an editorial, you know, institutional racism is dead. Folks on other networks have been trying to make this about every issue under the sun except racism. And so I think at some point we've got to realize this shooting and everything surrounding it is about fundamentally an unwillingness of a lot of white folks, not just this white terrorist who shot and killed these 9 people, but white America writ large, to not grapple honestly with our history and the implications of that history in the present. Until we do that, not only will the Civil War not be over, but the future of this country is going to be considerably in doubt as well.
And there are no 2 better people that I'd rather have this conversation with, because again, this is not easy, this is not simple, it is uncomfortable, I get that, but I think it is something that we need to do. Tim Weiss, Charles Blow, thanks so much for an intelligent conversation with me.
You bet, thank you.
All right, Chris, what you got coming up?
I got